Good evening, and so glad you could join us once again for part 3 of the Total Transformation series. Over the past few evenings, our hope is that you'll have heard something that will make a difference to your daily life. And tonight's program is no exception, and our 3 presenters are eager to pass on some of their knowledge and experience from their professional and their personal lives. So I'll hand over to Juliet now as she introduces our first presenter. Thank you, Juliet.
Thank you, Leroy. Tonight, I present to you Dr. Shyam. Dr. Shyam is from South India. He wanted to be a doctor from the age of 10. He made that a reality by studying hard and dedicating his life, his work, to becoming a doctor. He's been a doctor for 22 years. He's a husband and a father of 2. Dr. Shyam is a consultant, trauma and orthopedic surgeon. He works in Macclesfield and enjoys his job immensely. He really likes to teach and let others know about preventative health measures that they can take. This evening, the topic is entitled Matters of the Heart. What a wonderful topic that is. So I can't wait to hear from him. During the presentation, if you have any questions, please place them in the chat. The next voice that you will hear this evening is Dr. Shyam.
Hello, good evening, and thank you for the invitation. I hope you've had a good day, and I'm sure you're going to learn something with the time in the next half an hour. Now, just at the outset, I'd like to tell you all that our health is a choice. It's not by chance. It's not the genes that we inherit. It's not by luck that we have good health. This evening, I'm going to be going through some of the matters of the heart. I'm going to be discussing some of the matters of the heart. Basically, common heart conditions. My name is Shyam. So, there are lots of common heart conditions that people suffer from. And in any developed world like the UK, there are lots of people who suffer with heart problems, and a lot of them die from heart problems. These are some of the common problems that people have. One is irregular heartbeat, and there are various names given to them called the AF, atrial fibrillation, SVT, supraventricular tachycardia, or ectopics, or a missed beat. And the other condition is ischemic heart disease. I'm going to just try and keep it simple so that all of you can understand this. And I'm going to talk a little while about the heart attack and heart failure. So if you look at a heart, it looks something like this. I know some of you, I know that you all know that our heart is the size of a fist, but some of us have much, much bigger hearts. Now, this is the electrical system of the heart. So the electrical system of the heart looks like this. So if you can see, I don't know if you can see my mouse moving there, that's where the heartbeat generates, and called the SA node. And from there, it goes to the AV node. It's conducted to the AV node with those branches. And from this AV node, the electrical impulse goes to the rest of the heart. And once the impulse goes, just like how you switch on the light, the heart pumps. So this is a simple picture to show that SA node is where the heartbeat originates, goes up to the AV node, and it is transmitted to the rest of the heart to make the heart pump every second. Now, abnormal heart rhythm is something that can be too slow, it can be too fast, or too irregular. And over 2 million people in the UK suffer with an abnormal heart rhythm. However, they lead a very normal life once it is diagnosed and it is treated. The common symptoms are palpitation you can feel your heart beating fast or a missed beat, and you feel dizzy. So the reason for that is when the heart is not pumping enough, the blood doesn't go to the heart enough. And that's when the blood doesn't go to the brain enough, you will feel dizzy. And you can feel faint, and you can have a short of breath. So these are the common symptoms of an abnormal heart rhythm. So these are some of the names and the types of abnormal heart rhythms that are given and that are called. So everyone has a particular name given because of how it originates and the type of rhythm. So by far the most common one is atrial fibrillation. So basically, the top two chambers of the heart, they conduct the impulse to the rest of the heart. Sometimes the top chamber, it beats on its own without conducting it to the rest of the heart. So it fibrillates, which is it is beating on its own more than normal. So it is it is irregular, and it is quite faster than normal. It can be up to 120, 150 per minute. And the next one is supraventricular tachycardia, call it SVT, which comes very episodic. It comes very fast, and it can be a very scary experience for some people who get this. Bradycardia means a heart beat that is very, very slow, slower than normal. But some of you who are very healthy and athletic and do a lot of regular exercise, some of you might have a heart rate of only 50. That is normal, because your heart is so good that if it pumps for 50 times, that is enough for the body. But if your heart rate is much below that, if you're not athletic, if you're not well fit man or a woman, that's when you need to be worried about bradycardia. Heart block. Sometimes the heart beats more slowly than normal, and it can cause people to collapse because the blood supply is not going to the vital parts of the body. Ventricular fibrillation is another difficult one, which is more dangerous rhythm, and it is quite rare. So these are some of the rhythms. What are the causes for these? The causes are excess alcohol and being overweight. And if your heart is damaged because of a heart attack or a heart failure, which I'm going to discuss with, that also can cause abnormal heart rhythms. And these can be treated very well with medication once they're picked up early enough. And one of the medication that is always treated with is aspirin or any blood thinning medication to prevent clots in the hearts. So if the heart is not pumping enough, it is at risk of developing clots, and the clots can go to the other parts of the body and cause problems. Like I said, AF, atrial fibrillation, is a common cause of stroke, and it is, I'm going to show you in a picture how this causes stroke. And if you have AF, you're 5 times more likely to get a stroke. The arrhythmias, basically is another word for abnormal heart rhythm. It can kill over 100,000 people every year. So it's a common condition. Once it is picked up, it can be treated very well. And once it is treated, you can lead a normal life. The prevention and treatment of arrhythmias, you have to stop the triggers which cause this, like alcohol, tobacco, drinking too much coffee or anything that is containing caffeine. Certain over-the-counter medications and prescribed medicines also can cause that. Recreational drugs can cause that. And we need to maintain ideal body weight. And the key is early diagnosis and treatment. Do not be worried saying, oh, I don't feel like going to the doctor. It is just like doing, I don't feel like checking my tire pressure in the car. I just want to drive. You don't know when you will break down. So moving on to the diagnosis and treatment of this condition. So easily, sometimes it can be diagnosed with an ECG, which is a tracing of the heart. But sometimes if it doesn't show, that means if I don't have an abnormal heart rhythm, and if I have an ECG, it won't show. There should be abnormal heart rhythm when I have the ECG, then it will show. Otherwise, the doctor will put you on an ambulatory ECG. Basically, you'll put tags on your body, and then it will record your heart rhythm for 24 hours or 72 hours, and then they will look at the rhythm. And there is other ways of doing that with the electrophysiological study, etc. Like treatment, I have said, medication, blood thinning medication, cardioversion, where basically they suddenly stop the heart rhythm and then start again, and it's back to normal. Catheter ablation, and these are some of the other things that I'm going to skip. I'm going to move on to the reason why we can get a stroke arising from the heart. So the picture of the heart here, and if the heart is not pumping, if it is weak, if it is beating too slowly, clots can form in the heart. And if the clot forms in the heart, it can find its way through these arteries or the blood vessels and go to the brain and cause a block in one of the arteries, which will block blood supply to a part of the brain, and that's what a stroke is. There is another form of stroke which can happen because of a burst blood vessel, but that is more dangerous, and that usually happens with an uncontrolled blood pressure. Now, staying safe with arrhythmia or the abnormal heart rhythm, you must tell the DVLA if it affects your driving. And if you're working at heights or with a heavy machinery, you've got to be careful. Now, second one, I'm going to talk about ischemic heart disease. It's nothing but ischemia is basically lack of blood. So I want to tell you what it is like having atherosclerosis, angina, and heart attack. These are all medical terms, but then I'll try and make it simple. So what is so unique about the heart? If you look at the hand, there are two arteries or the blood vessels. So one on each side. I hope you can see the pictures. So these two arteries will form two arches. And from each arch, there's one vessel going to each finger and supplies the blood. Imagine if one of the arteries is blocked on one side, there is still another artery which can go on supplying the blood for the rest of the fingers. However, in the heart, it is not so. In the heart, the arteries do not contribute blood to the other arteries. So they are called end arteries. So one artery supplies certain part of the heart only. So it does not contribute to each other. So that's how that is. So if you look at this picture, each color is showing blood supply from one artery. So yellow one, it supplies just that part, green, purple, blue, etc. One part of the blood vessel does not supply other part. So that's the key with the heart, and that's why it's important. Atherosclerosis is a condition where fat gets deposited. So on the left top, you see a normal blood vessel inside. So on the top right, you see when there is a tear in the wall, it can cause blood clotting. But in the picture on the left corner, bottom, you see how the fat is deposited. Cholesterol is deposited in the artery, and it causes decreased space for the blood to flow. And like I said in the previous picture, if one artery is blocked, another artery cannot supply the blood. So they're all end arteries. So if one artery is not supplying blood to the heart, that part of the blood vessel or the heart doesn't receive blood supply. So the atherosclerosis is basically hardening and becoming narrow of the blood vessels. It restricts the blood flow and oxygen to the tissues. So if I'm walking, if I'm sitting, that's fine because my heart is still receiving enough blood. But if I'm doing any activity like cycling or walking fast, jogging, then the blood supply that is going through the heart is not enough for that activity, and I will get chest pain. So that's what is called angina. So if I'm walking about half a mile and if I'm getting pain, then that is a condition I need to go see the doctor. I will tell you where the pain comes from. There is increased risk of blood clots, and once a blood vessel is fully blocked with a clot, that's what heart attack is. If you and I have atherosclerosis, we may not have any symptoms unless we put ourselves at a strenuous work, but it can lead to life-threatening events like heart attack and stroke, and angina is a chest pain. Who is at risk? Smoking, lack of exercise, unhealthy, high-fat diet, if you're obese or overweight, excess alcohol, high blood pressure, diabetes. If you are from South Asian countries or from the Afro-Caribbean descent, we are at higher risk. cholesterol is basically too much of fatty substance in the blood. And by eating more fatty food and not exercising enough and being overweight and alcohol, etc., there is higher risk. And you lower your cholesterol by eating healthy and getting more exercise. And again, you cannot know it unless you have a blood test for cholesterol. Now, moving on to angina chest pain, it can be pain at rest if it is very critically blocked, or pain at activity, pain on stressful activity, or critical ischemia. Critical ischemia is even when you're at rest, you have pain. Remember this picture? The blood vessels or the arteries are not communicating with each other, and when one artery is blocked, that part of the heart can get heart attack. Same picture again. Now, look at this picture. This is the picture which is showing a blood vessel. The yellow thing that you see is the cholesterol, which is blocking the blood vessel. And these discs, red discs that you see are the red blood cells. So if it is not flowing freely, if there's any damage to the blood vessel, and if under activity, under stress, that's when a heart attack happens. You see these blood cells clotted together, and that's what causes heart attack. And blood supply to that part of the heart is not there anymore, and you'll get severe chest pain, and it is dangerous. Now, if you forget everything that I've said so far, it's fine. Just remember this, because what I'm going to say. I have seen so many people brought dead to the hospitals because they thought it was not the pain that they were getting was not from the heart. So this is the area where you get pain. It's usually in the chest on the left side where the heart is, and it can go up to the jaw and up to the ear, and it goes on the inside of the left side, left arm. So that's where the pain goes. It's like heaviness in the heart, and it goes there, and associated with profuse sweating. You will feel very sick, you will feel like vomiting, and this pain can last for about 20 to 30 minutes. Most people mistake this pain for indigestion, but it's not. This is a separate pain, and feeling sick and severe sweating, and you can faint. And the pain location, please be mindful of this. Chest tightness, as if some heaviness on the heart. That's what people feel. You can have lightheadedness and shortness of breath. Emergency treatment for a heart attack or chest pain, please call ambulance. Don't ask for a friend. Don't wait for your husband or wife to come back from work to take you to the hospital. Time is very important, because if it is clotting, the treatment is to dissolve the clot, which can happen within an hour. And dissolve the clot, that's the thing. And angiogram is they do an X-ray with something which will show where the blocks are, and if necessary, the doctors will restore the blood supply to the heart. And you will also have medication for blood thinning to prevent further clots. Who is at risk? Same things: smoking, lack of exercise, unhealthy fat diet, overweight, obese, excess alcohol. Same. Remember, prevention of angina or heart attack or any of these health conditions is the key. Prevention is the key. And somebody said, prevention is the daughter of intelligence. So if we are intelligent enough, we will prevent all these problems. Just before I close, I would like to say that the heart rhythms that we discussed earlier, whenever somebody gets a severe chest pain, angina, or a heart attack, these heart rhythms, abnormal heart rhythms, can be severe. Heart failure is when a part of the heart is damaged and the heart is not able to pump the blood enough, and a lot of the blood is still remaining in the heart and it's not able to pump the blood out. That's when heart failure is, and it will have a backflow of all the blood and it stays in the lung, and that's what causes breathing difficulty. That's what heart failure is. I hope this helps, and I'm open for some questions. I'm not an expert and I'm not a cardiologist, but I'll try and answer the questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Sham. We've just got a few questions to ask you. What exactly is cholesterol?
Cholesterol is a normal chemical that is found in the body. It is found in the diet, And actually the body makes a lot of cholesterol inside the body because it needs it, because it forms part of the hormones and the chemicals that are normally inside the body. Cholesterol is also present in every cell membrane, every cell. So every cell makes cholesterol, but then if the cholesterol is too much, that's when we have problems with the problems that we discussed.
Okay, so leading on from that, what foods contain cholesterol?
The foods that are high in cholesterol are the red meat, meat pies, sausages, and fatty meat, eggs, butter, cheese, especially the hard cheese like cheddar cheese, cream, and cakes and biscuits, and foods that contain certain types of oils. But also I would like to tell you that if we eat whole meal food, and brown rice or brown pasta, and lots of nuts and seeds and fruits and vegetables, that is protective against high cholesterol.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. My next question is, can lifestyle changes prevent heart disease? If I'm at risk, for example.
Yes, some of us can be at risk if we have a family history. If we cannot metabolize cholesterol in a normal way, then there can be high deposits of cholesterol in the body. So cholesterol is also not water soluble, so it doesn't get absorbed in the blood. So it just gets transferred from one place to the other, and it gets deposited in places. So like I said, normally our blood has, normally our body has cholesterol, but if we eat unhealthy food like the ones we mentioned, we are taking extra cholesterol, which the body is not able to metabolize. So if I am at high risk of getting a heart disease, with lifestyle, with exercise and eating healthy food and keeping the diabetes and blood pressure under control, we can postpone any cardiac problems or heart problems for a good 15, 20 years. And these are also reversible through lifestyle.
Brilliant. That's interesting. A question's just come in. At the moment, a keto diet seems to be a good thing. Everybody's talking about a keto diet. In light of that, you've said eating high amounts of meat is not really good for us. But yet, a keto diet tells us that we need to eat this amount of meat. What do you think about the keto?
Ketone diet, as many of you may be interested in, but it's not a very healthy diet, because nowadays, all of you probably know that the meat that we eat is very much processed, and the animals that people eat nowadays, they're all given lots of medication like antibiotics, steroids, and hormones, so that they can produce more milk, and even the animals can grow to a bigger size quickly. So for example, a chicken grows up to a size of the adult in a matter of 6 weeks. So imagine the amount of hormones and chemicals that these chickens are given at an industrial scale, so that they're produced for somebody to make money. So the ketone diet is basically, you don't eat certain foods, but you eat a lot of meat and other things, but it's not a balanced diet, because you do need some carbohydrates. You also need a lot of fiber in your diet. You need to have some nuts and oils that you can get from the nuts, but just eating just the meat is not a good idea.
Okay. Have you got any life habit tips that you can share with us?
Exercise. Half an hour of exercise, at least 4 times a week, is an excellent thing that you can do for yourself. It can help your blood pressure, diabetes. It can prevent you from getting diabetes. And when you do exercise, make sure you feel the heart beating fast enough, so that there is some exercise on the heart or the cardio. Otherwise, if you're just going for a stroll, it doesn't really help. You don't have to run, but if you do brisk walking, that will make you sweat a little bit, and that will help you to breathe in nicely and have a lot of lung exercise. That also helps you. So that's one. Next one, keeping your diabetes and blood pressure under control is the second one. And the third one is keeping, having the mental health, not expecting and not having stress in your life is an important thing. I'm sure the next speaker is going to talk about that. And the last one is definitely diet. We are what we eat and drink, and we've got to be careful with what we eat and drink. Because if there is a lot of cholesterol in the meat, if there's a lot of cholesterol in the eggs and butter, why would I want to put them into my body if it is going to cause me harm? So these are some of the main things that you've got to be careful, especially if you're from South Asia or from the Afro-Caribbean, we're at a higher risk.
Thank you. My final question to you is, have you come across this term, heart congestion? What is heart congestion?
Heart congestion, it could, I don't know what people would mean, but what it actually implies is that when the heart is not pumping normally, if the part of the heart wall is weak, then that part of the heart won't be pumping enough, and that will cause something called a back pressure, because the blood comes from the lungs to the heart, and then the heart pumps it out. So if the heart is not pumping out, the back pressure goes into the lungs, and the lung accumulates the fluid in the chest, and that's what causes breathing difficulty. People find that they're not able to lie down flat, and they have to get propped up and sit with a couple of pillows. And even if they sleep in the night, sometimes they wake up with severe air hunger. That's what is chest congestion, I would call.
Thank you. Dr. Sham, we want to thank you so much for your presentation. It's been really interesting. And we just want to thank those who've sent in the questions, and you've answered them so well. So I want to thank you for that. I will now hand over the time to Pamela Taylor. Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry, I wasn't able to unmute myself. Apparently the host was muting me. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, and it is Dr. Magna Parks. Now, I met Dr. Magna Parks probably about 5 or 6 years ago when she was doing a session on well-being in Manchester, and I was quite impressed with the presentation, particularly with her being a psychologist and also with me being a fellow psychologist. I was really keen to hear what insight she had to provide me with. Yesterday's session, we had some real gems in terms of how we need to move from the past. We must move from the past and not allow ourselves to continuously drift back into the past. And we touched on this term known as adverse childhood experiences, which talks about traumatic experiences that children from a young age may experience. We found out that up to 90% of us will experience at least one serious trauma in our life that can hinder us from moving on and living a fulfilled life. And we were provided with 2 principles to support this. And one of the main principles to help us move forward is don't allow yourself to constantly rehearse or ruminate on the past. The second one was, don't engage in blaming the person who may have been a problem in your life or caused you trauma. It's important that you learn to forgive and to move on in order to experience healing within your life. We're also encouraged to not be a victim, but strive to be a survivor and also a thriver. In addition to that, but we would also encourage to learn to forgive the perpetrator or whoever may have caused us a problem. Because at the end of the day, when you learn to forgive, you are allowing yourself as an individual to be healed. We also looked at when you learn to forgive and you're willing to move forward into the future, you'll experience this thing that is known as post-traumatic growth. And with post-traumatic growth, this is where the individual is able to look at the past, learn from the past, and then move on into the future. And by doing so, they'll learn to develop resilience, which will enable them to deal with any other traumas that may come in their lives or that they may have to encounter. In addition to this, we're also encouraged to help others to heal from the experiences that we may have experienced. So as we grow and as we develop resilience, it's important that we help others who may be going through similar experiences to learn to heal and develop strategies in order for them to move forward and experience a more fulfilled life. And so to condense this, it was a case of we need to learn to commit to move forward, learn to forgive, stop being a victim, learn to grow from our experiences, and when necessary, seek help and encourage others to grow in order to experience fulfilled lives. There's also one other thing that we're encouraged to do. If you're finding that you can't move on into the future, it's important that you learn to seek help. And you may be able to seek help by visiting your general practitioner, who will be able to signpost you to various agencies who will be able to support you. In the event of you needing to support an individual or a child who may be experiencing some kind of trauma or abuse, it's important that you refer them on to the head teacher of the school, the local authority or social services, or any other agency who may be able to provide them with support. Is that today's session is going to be on guilt and shame, and it's at this point I'm going to pass over to Magna Park. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. It's good to be with you again. Thank you for that summary, Ms. Pamela. I appreciate it. And hopefully that those who were listening were able to remember some of those things based on what she shared. So today we're going to get right into the good and the bad of guilt and shame. I may be moving a little fast. I'll try not to, but there's so much I want to share with you at this time. A lot of times we think of guilt and shame as completely negative. And based on my work, based on my understanding, based on my biblical knowledge, I have learned over the years that guilt and shame is not always bad. There's some good to it, mostly bad, but there's sometimes when guilt and shame is good. So we're going to talk about the bad and the good. There's a difference between guilt and shame. We may use those terms interchangeably, but they're really not the same. Guilt is when you feel bad for what you have done. You engage in a behavior, you believe that you have done something bad, and you feel bad about that. Shame, on the other hand, is when you feel bad for what you have done. So feeling bad for, I'm sorry, I just said that. I said that wrong. Feeling bad for what you've done is guilt. Shame is feeling bad for who you are. Please forgive me. I hope I didn't confuse you. Guilt is feeling bad for what you've done, and shame is feeling bad for who you are. Shame is that inner experience of feeling not wanted, of feeling worthless, of feeling rejected, of feeling cast out. And so you want to distinguish between the two. Oftentimes, people may feel the same together, the two things together, but they are different. You know, in the field of psychology, when I was being trained, guilt was looked at years ago as something terrible. In fact, one psychologist says, guilt is the worst experience known to humans. It makes you feel unworthy and miserable. It's caused by you thinking you've done something wrong. And then this psychologist says, there is no right or wrong. only experiences to learn from. So get out there, enjoy learning and living and growing, toss guilt out. That is not exactly correct. And we'll see that as we move forward. But that's what some psychologists or mental health people may think, get rid of guilt. And that's not necessarily healthy. But when we experience guilt, that can lead to fear, because sometimes when we engage in behaviors that we know are wrong, we live a fearful life because we're afraid of being found out and we're afraid of the consequence. Guilt can also lead, and I should say unhealthy guilt, can also lead to self-condemnation and punishment. Sometimes you may believe you have to punish yourself to feel good again. You may end up engaging in some type of penance to atone for your wrongdoings. This may happen a lot with people who are addicted. I had a person that I know, I'm going to try to be as general as possible, who had a problem with engaging in certain sexual behaviors that was not healthy. And this person revealed to me that when they would engage in the behavior, they would feel so bad that then they'd go away to the mountains for a day or two, praying and pleading with God. And the guilt was so bad that they would end up engaging in the behavior again. In fact, that's considered a cycle of addiction sometimes, is that we don't know how to properly deal with the guilt when we engage in a behavior that's not healthy. And so when we don't know how to properly deal with it, then we end up engaging in that behavior even more. So guilt can sometimes lead to that kind of self-condemnation and punishment. And guilt can also, negative guilt or unhealthy guilt can also negatively affect our psychological and physical health. One writer over 100 years ago, a health educator, told us in the book Ministry of Healing, she says, grief, anxiety, discontent, remorse, guilt, distrust, all tend to break down the life forces and to invite decay and even death. Some people actually end up dying because of guilt. And I look at sometimes when people commit suicide, sometimes people get to the point where they don't know what to do with the guilt. They feel so bad about poor choices in life, things that they've done, and the only out that they see is suicide. So these tend to break down the life forces, as this writer has told us. And when it's combined with the belief that you need to punish yourself, guilt becomes very unhealthy. And sometimes we have a false image of God because we believe that God is looking down on us and chastising us and condemning us because of the things we have done. But oftentimes, I could tell you, we're harder on ourselves than God is. God is a forgiving God. And hopefully, as you go through this series, some of that will be talked about. There's also something known as false guilt. This occurs when we feel guilty for things that's really not bad, or some of us have consciences that are falsely trained. We grow up in homes where we're led to feel guilty for things that are really not things to feel guilty about. And so we end up being adults that feel guilty very quickly, and we have sensitive consciences, and we feel guilty in time that we don't need to feel guilty. Another type of false guilt is when we have confessed something we've done wrong, we've repented of it, but we still continue to feel guilty. So we have to be careful when we feel guilt. When I talk to my clients sometimes who are struggling with guilt, I ask them, is your guilt true or is it false? And the true guilt will help you to move towards correcting your behavior, will help you, if you are a believer in God, to ask for forgiveness. But false guilt will continue to just cause you to beat yourself on the head, condemning yourself, constantly feeling bad. That is a false type of guilt. One psychologist says this tricky emotion, false guilt, puts us on the hamster wheel of life, a never-ending treadmill of uncertainty. Have you ever seen hamsters? They're on this wheel and they're just going round and round and round. There is no pleasing this taskmaster, false guilt, because there's always another chore to fulfill, another person to try very hard to please, even when pleasing them is not the best thing. People driven by false guilt, we're told, often feel that they have to go through life perfectly so that they can avoid criticism and disappointing others. Some of us are on that treadmill. We're doing everything we can to make sure people don't criticize us, to make sure we don't disappoint others, because we feel guilty if we disappoint others. We feel guilty if we criticize. So we're doing whatever we can to stay away from that. And I could tell you, that type of life is tiring. So if you're living that type of life, you really might want to look at it and say, how do I get out of this, this whole thing of false guilt? And you can do so. And then there's shame. Shame comes in many different forms. Shame started actually in the Garden of Eden when our first parents, Adam and Eve, disobeyed God, and they wanted to hide. They felt shame. And so they wanted to get rid of the feeling. And so they tried to cover themselves with fig leaves. And since that time, we as human beings have been trying to cover ourselves when we feel ashamed with all types of things that are not healthy. So let's just talk about shame a little bit. There are many things that we can do to shame us. Sexual abuse, physical abuse, verbal abuse, the actions of others, having our faults pointed out, being belittled or criticized publicly. All of these things can lead to shame. Shame involved with abuse, especially sexual abuse, is something that is horrendous. The experience of being violated and being taken advantage of is a horrible one. And I've talked to many people who have been through this. But today, because we have such a short period of time, I'm not going to talk too much about the shame that comes from a sexual abuse or physical abuse. That's a whole nother seminar in itself. But I want to just acknowledge that because some of you listening may have felt that shame and may still be feeling that shame. And it's understandable because you have been violated, but you don't have to stay in that shameful state. And we're going to talk about that. Shame can also be experienced when others who are close to us do something that we don't like and we feel personally affected. Sometimes people who are close to us may do things, parents may experience this with children or children with parents, where one or the other does something and the other party feels so ashamed because of what that person has done or what that person has said. So shame can be experienced in a variety of ways. And so I want to talk about something we don't hear a lot about, and that's a phenomenon known as shame-based families. The emphasis of shame-based families is to project a healthy image to others, even though the family has problems. What matters most to these type of families, the shame-based families, is not the healing of its members, but that the family maintains its reputation at all costs. Shame-based families, they try to hide family problems such as addiction to pornography, alcohol or drugs, gambling, marital discord, outbursts of anger, rebellious teenagers, the list go on. They want to hide this. And when a family member tries to get help, some of the family members in this shame-based situation, they get angry. They're not angry because a family member is hurting. They're angry because the family member is shattering their image. I remember a girlfriend of mine who died several years ago, and she was having some mental health issues. And the parent actually called me and asked me to make sure that when she acts out, that I don't tell people it's mental health issues, that I try to come up with some other reason. This was a reputable family. The father had a very high position, and they did not want people to know that their daughter was suffering. She ended up dying. Very sad. So shame-based families can be very, very hurtful and very damaging for people. Then sometimes we use shame with others. We're talking about shame. Some parents, some spouses and others sometimes use shame to get family members or even their children to do something that they desire, or to do something that they don't like, or to stop doing something that they don't like. And so it's believed that if they can shame them in front of people, that can motivate them to change. You may have a parent who says something about what their child did in school, or their child not doing well in front of a large group of people or other family members with the child around, hoping that that might change the child's behavior. Or you might have a spouse or a partner who jokingly says something about their partner or spouse in front of others. Again, the idea is maybe if I could say this in front of the other people, they will be motivated to change. I could tell you that does not work. They may change for a brief moment, but resentment can build. They get resentful because you are embarrassing them in front of other people, and they're exposed. And most of the time when people are exposed for the wrong reason, they will not respond in the way that you desire. So you have to think of other ways to get people to change, to do things that you may want them to do, as opposed to shaming them. The whole area of bullying, psychologists have found out that many bullies are shame prone, and that's why they bully other people. Their mean behavior keeps their self-esteem high. It takes the attention away from them and puts it on other people. And the bully gives away their shame, so to speak, by putting down other people. And a bully wants to make another person feel ashamed and feel bad about their inadequacies. So they're taking the focus away from how shameful they feel, and they're putting it onto other people. But that only is a short-term way of dealing with shame. It hurts other people, but in the long run, that bully still deals with shame. So that persons who are bullying, the one thing that's helpful for them is to get in touch with the reasons they do that. What parts of them are they ashamed of? Why are they ashamed? How can they deal with those things that shame them? So there's so much connected with shame. It's even been found that some people don't go to doctors because of shame. They're afraid of what the doctors may tell them, that they need to lose weight or they need to change this or change that. So they stay away from the medical system. So shame can do a lot of negative things in our lives. It can cause us to shame others. It can cause us to not want others to know what's going on in our families. It could cause us to feel bad. It could cause us to hurt others, to stay away from getting help. Shame, these are such negative aspects of shame and guilt. But I want to also talk about, believe it or not, the good aspects. I believe, because I'm a believer in God, that when we feel guilt, that is a signal, that is an alarm system that's telling us something is wrong. Without guilt, we would not be able to know when there's something wrong in our lives and that needs to be addressed. It's like people with leprosy can't feel. There's certain parts of their body that they can't feel. And if they put their hand on a hot stove or something, they wouldn't be able to know to remove it. Well, guilt is kind of like that. It's that system to say something is wrong, something needs to be done. And I consider that to be the good side of guilt. We need guilt in our lives. We just need the right kind of guilt. And I ran across this of the gift of shame. And there were some things the author shared that I thought was so powerful. Shame can be helpful because it can be corrective and it can be preventive in that it helps us not to make the same mistake again. Now, this is for shame where we're shamed because of something we have done. Okay, this is not the shame when something has been done to you. Shame can also help us to repair when an action has caused harm to relationships, and that's guilt too. If we feel shame and guilt, sometimes it helps us to see, I need to do something because this has caused harm to my relationship with such and such. Shame and guilt can also help us to identify and take accountability for our actions. Without shame and guilt, we can end up not realizing that we need to be accountable for these things that we've done wrong. And can also, when others see that we are experiencing some degree of shame, our defenses can go down and healing conversations can take place. Sometimes you're in a relationship with someone and they feel as you've done something wrong, but you don't express the shame or the guilt about it. And the defenses are up where they don't want to talk and they don't want to correspond about what has happened. But when you acknowledge your shame and guilt, it can go a long way towards helping people see, wow, they realize how much they've hurt me. They realize that this is something they've done wrong. And then some healing conversations can occur. I've worked with people that I've encouraged them when they've done wrong to go to the person to whom they have hurt or whom they have hurt. And a lot of healing has occurred. Now, if you're experiencing shame because of what someone has done, that's a whole nother story. Abuse or rejection. That's not the kind of shame I'm talking about with these things where I'm talking about the gift of shame. That's not a gift. However, you can deal with that shame by recognizing that this situation does not define who you are. Sometimes you may need to talk to someone If you are a believer, you can go to God and he'll be willing to help you with that shame as well. So if you're dealing with guilt, I have some steps for you. First of all, I want to ask you, and I hope you don't mind, I'm kind of interspersing back and forth between guilt and shame because I'm putting them both together in this talk. Ask yourself if your guilt is appropriate. Ask yourself, is this true guilt or is this false guilt? If it is, address it and recognize how it can help you redirect your life. Make changes instead of wallowing in your guilt. Apologize if you need to, for example. So instead of sitting around feeling this guilt, say, what can I do? Is there someone I need to talk to? Is there something I need to apologize to? Make changes. Accept that you did something wrong and then move on. If you did something wrong, you can't change the past. But if you can make amends and move on, that's going to be helpful. Spending a lot of time thinking and obsessing about the guilt will not help you. You need to move forward. And then something else to share about the guilt is to learn from your mistakes. Guilt can be a good teacher. Feeling shame about what you've done can also be a good teacher. And so you want to look at your life and think and say to yourself, what is it that I can do to address this shame and this guilt? And you know, there's a verse in the Bible that I have to bring up that tells us if we go to God in 1 John 1:9 and confess our sins, he will forgive us and he will cleanse us. And I, as a psychologist, there's just so much or so far I can go in helping people deal with guilt who are not believers. I have to be honest, because I believe that there are some situations with guilt and shame that is humanly impossible to overcome. But I believe that if you believe in God, or if you know who he is and that he's a loving God, that you can go to him and ask him to help you to move past this guilt and shame. And understand that he loves us, because that love can do so much to heal us. And it's our privilege to go to him and be cleansed, because we're told that he heals the brokenhearted. In Psalms, one of my favorite books, especially as I've gone through things in life, we're told that God heals the brokenhearted and binds up our wounds. He wants to do that for us. So if you're dealing with shame and guilt, I want you to think about talking to God about it, because I just see how helpful it is to do so. I think psychology can only go so far in helping people move past that. However, the steps that I mentioned earlier about acknowledging if it's appropriate, making changes instead of wallowing, those things can be helpful as well. If you're dealing with a lot of shame from abuse, it may be good to talk to someone, a counselor or a spiritual person, to help you work through some of that shame and not to wallow in it. It can be helpful. I know I've gone over a little, but there was so much information that I had to share, and unfortunately I have to end at exactly 2 today. So I'm going to stop right now, and I hope that these comments have been helpful to you. I will stop now for questions.
Thank you, Dr. Parks. One question that's come through, a couple of questions actually. If you did something wrong to someone and they are not aware of it, you ask for forgiveness from God, however, still feel guilty for not telling them because you think it will affect your relationship, just telling them help to get rid of the false guilt?
Whoa, that's a long question. I don't know if I caught all of it. Can you, what's the basic, that was a lot there.
Yeah,
well,
it is a loaded
the first
question.
thing that came, go ahead.
Well, if you've done something wrong to someone and they're not aware of it, but you're feeling guilty about it, you've talked to God about it, but yet you're still feeling guilty about it, just telling them help get rid of the false guilt.
Yeah, that's a false guilt. If you've talked to God about it and you're feeling bad about it, that's a clear sign of a false guilt. So that is something that you really have to work through with God, and you really have to get to the point where you truly believe he has forgiven you. It is when you believe God has forgiven you that you can move past that guilt. And I just want to throw this out that I tell people, if you are a believer, I can tell you this. Read Psalms 32 and Psalm 51 and put your name where you can in those chapters. It's done wonders for people that I've spoken to who stated that they have not felt forgiven by God. So I want to recommend that to you. Psalm 32, Psalm 51, put your name in there and you will see what can happen if you do that.
Okay, the other one is, what is the difference between guilt and conscience?
That's a good one. Conscience tells you what is right and what is wrong. And so the conscience actually, based on how it judges you and based on what it tells you, can actually lead you to feel guilty or not guilty. So the conscience, what your conscience tells you is what's right and what's wrong. And when you engage in a behavior, how that conscience responds to the behavior will determine whether or not you feel guilty. So I hope that makes sense. The conscience tells you what's right and wrong. When you do a behavior, it tells you what's right and what's wrong, and then the guilt can come from that based on what your conscience tells you.
Okay. Another one is, I hurt someone badly in the past and I feel really guilty about it, but there's no way of me getting in touch with them to apologize. How do I deal with this guilt?
All right. That is something that, again, you can go to God with. But even before that, what I have people do often is I tell them, write a letter to the person. I know the person cannot get it, but there's something therapeutic about writing a letter and saying, I apologize for what I've done, admitting your faults, but then ending the letter in a positive way. And if you are a believer, going to the scripture and finding some encouraging verses to end a letter with. Letter writing can do wonders for people who are dealing with issues where they can't talk to a person. Either the person is not around or the person wouldn't be open. But I would suggest writing a letter. And if you're a believer, asking God to help you to move past that as well.
Okay. Do you have time for one more, or is that it? Have you got time for one more?
I do, yes.
Okay, great. Here's one. How do I manage the shame or guilt of an eating disorder, bulimia and purging?
That one you're going to need to talk to a professional. There's nothing that I can say in 2 minutes that will deal with that issue. Some of the things that I talked about in terms of turning to God can be a beginning step and asking Him to help you. But you have to get out of that cycle of the eating disorder, and only a professional can help you with that. So I strongly encourage you to talk to someone about that. I have time for one more if you have another question.
Are some people more prone to experience guilt than others?
Yes, they are. I talked in my seminar, my talk, I mentioned something called a falsely trained conscience. Sometimes people grow up in homes where they are made to feel guilty about little things, dropping a cup on the floor, or making a mistake in the kitchen, or not doing a particular task. And so they have a falsely trained conscience where they're led to feel guilty about things that really are not things to feel guilt about. And as a result, they grow up and they end up tending to be more guilty and feeling more guilty and struggling with guilt more than others. So yes, that does happen, sad to say. But if we deal with some of the things I've mentioned, you can even move past that guilt as well.
Okay, I'd like to say thank you, Dr. Parks, for your presentation and also answering all of those questions. And I'd like to now hand over to Stella.
Thank you, Pamela. Very insightful as well. Thank you. Right, good evening, viewers and the panel. I'd like to thank you for giving me the opportunity to raise some burning questions, particularly centered on philosophical issues that we face today. But before I do that, I'd like to introduce you to a colleague of mine who will be our presenter on the above matter, thereby taking the hot seat. His name is Merlvin, a practicing primary healthcare professional who is a registered pharmacist. His interests are in preventative health, clinical leadership, and management. He is married and has a son, and a daughter as well. Okay, so before we begin, obviously that's the introduction to Merlvin. I will just get down straight to business and ask Merlvin this question, which is a question and a statement rolled into one. The statement and question I'll put to you this evening, Merlvin, is that there are more conflicts and bloodshed in the name of religion. Don't you think the world would be a better place without any religious beliefs?
Wow, thanks, Stella. That's a pertinent question indeed. And it's actually one that comes up a lot when you get involved in religious discussions. So let's look at the nature of the question so that we can break it down to an understandable format. So it basically says statement A, which is that there are a lot of conflicts and bloodshed in the name of religion. And so that's your statement A. And it describes that as something undesirable. And therefore it says that statement B should make sense because statement B follows from statement A. Then it says, do you not agree? So, but if you look at that, so you have two statements. Statement A is saying that religion is basically what it translates to is that religion is the main cause or the primary cause for conflict and bloodshed. Is that necessarily true? Is the question that we should be asking before we move on to the second question. So it's saying that religion is a prime driver of conflict and bloodshed. The challenge that we're facing is that the context of conflict and bloodshed is not defined. But I suppose you can allow me to suppose that when people hear the word conflict and bloodshed, they would normally understand this to refer to a context of war and to large-scale fighting between nations or between large groups of people. So we can start off with this assumption in terms of conflict. However, even if we look at small-scale domestic conflict or random acts of violence, we shall address this in this discussion as we go along. So let's start off with the discussion of conflict and bloodshed in the context of war, which is war between nations, between large groups of people within a nation. It's useful to ask if anybody has ever carried out a study on war and its causes across the span of human history. And the answer, thankfully, is that somebody has done that. And so in this vein, we can turn to two monumental works. The first one is a work by two gentlemen called Charles Phillips and another one called Alan Axelrod. And then there's a second one that you can get from a publication called Gale Publishing House. So the first work by Charles Phillips and Alan Axelrod is entitled An Encyclopedia of Wars, Facts on File of World History. It's available on Amazon for those who are interested, and it's only £280 if you're willing to save for a while. And the second one has the title, The Gale Encyclopedia of World History. Now, this is available online from a lot of university libraries. So I got access to it from the University of Manchester Library. So that also deals with this question. So the first encyclopedia was published in 2004, and the second one was published in the year 2008. So anyway, that's enough about that. What you're interested in is what findings we get from these publications. Now, obviously, I can't go through the whole encyclopedia, but in a nutshell, it appears that religion as a cause of war accounts for less than 7% of all wars from the period, what they say from 8000 BC until 2000 AD. So just 7%. Now, I'm going to share just the screen so you can see what this means. 7% is not really a lot. So for those who may think, okay, so what does 7% mean? On your screen there, you can see that, okay, so religion on the blue, the 3.8% there relates to wars that they've attributed to Islam. The 3.2% are wars that are non-Islam, but the 93%, which is the bulk of the wars that have occurred throughout history, not related to religion. They are secular religions, as it were. So in real terms, of the 1,763 wars that were reviewed by these publications, at the time of publication, only around 122 could be attributed to religion as a cause.
Okay, so, right, if you hang on a minute. So what you're telling me, Merlvin, is that the root cause of wars, that is the secular causes, they are secular causes, and they're not connected with religious or spiritual matters. That's the 93%.
Yep.
Interesting. Okay, so to my next question, what are these secular causes? Before you get onto that, another question, what of the smaller level conflicts that are not on similar scales as the wars, the wars that you have mentioned in the books above? Are you able to answer that for me?
I'm glad you've asked that one as well, because I was also fascinated by that, thinking, okay, so 93%, I mean, that's a big chunk. So let's turn to some other references that also look at this. And I'm thankful to the University of Manchester because I was able to just go into their online library and to do this. So there are some other books that relate to wars and causes. So the first one is by Dr. David Ohm of Oglethorpe University, and it's entitled Human Nature and the Causes of War. It's published by Palgrave Macmillan and Macmillan. Another book is entitled Causes of War, and then Power and the Roots of Conflict. And this one is by Dr. Stephen Van Evera. It was first published in 1999 by Cornell University Press. Finally, we can draw insights from a recent book from this year, actually, the year 2020. And it's a publication from the University of Oxford. And it's by a gentleman called Dr. Mark Juggensmeyer. It's entitled God at War, a meditation on religion and warfare. Right, so we obviously don't have the time to look at each book in detail, but we would be interested in what they have to say. So I'll summarize their conclusions as follows. So you have what you'd call the primary drivers or the primary factors that can cause people and nations to think of war, right? So what you might refer to as primary factors. So for ease of understanding, I've classified these into three. So they are what you'd call power and control factors. Then secondly, you have economic factors. And thirdly, you have social justice and morality factors. So what do you mean by power and control factors? So power and control factors, it's a desire for power or the perception of being powerful. So people who are in power like to be seen as powerful. I think we can relate this when we think about certain political strongmen, in some countries right now, at the risk of being hacked. We know that there are countries that have what are referred to as dictators. I shall not mention names. So it also lies, so this is on a grand scale, but at a domestic scale, sometimes violence occurs because people want to exert power and they want to exert control, right? So it's just psychological. Second one, when you talk about economic factors, so people go into conflict or into war when there's a competition for or a desire to control natural resources such as land, minerals, water, oil, and gas. So we only need to look at the colonial history of many nations in Africa and Asia for examples of this, when developed nations raided those countries because they wanted to gain control of those resources. Or we can even look at recent wars in the Middle East for that as well. Then when you talk about social justice and morality factors, it can be argued that the prime reason for the involvement of quite a lot of people and nations in the Second World War, for instance, was the desire to stem the evils of the Holocaust. So although it is true that German support for the war was partly driven by economic factors arising from the First World War, when some countries got into the war, they wanted to stop what was happening to the Jews in that country. So now these are factors that can influence the occurrence of war, but they don't or conflict, but they don't necessarily have to lead to actual conflict. So when it comes to the actual breaking out of conflict, you can think of what you called confounding factors. So there's the guy called Stephen Evera, who wrote the book Causes of War, Power and the Roots of Conflict, says that there are additional conditions that usually exist before actual conflict breaks out. So he identifies 5 factors. The first one is false optimism. This is a belief on the part of the aggressor that the outcome of the conflict will be beneficial to the aggressor in relation to the factors of power, economics, and social justice that we mentioned before. Secondly, the second factor is called jumping the gun. This is an additional condition or confounding factor. So jumping the gun, and he calls it first mover advantages and crisis instability. So this is when the aggressor believes that if they make the first move now, they are more guaranteed of success than at a later stage, or if the other party strikes first, right? So if we think about the Second World War, we might think of Japan attacking the United States at Pearl Harbor as an instance of first mover strike. And then we can talk about power shifts as a third additional condition. So when there are windows of opportunity and vulnerability, so if there are sharp fluctuations in the relative strength of individuals or nations, these create opportunities of vulnerability and opportunity, and people want to strike whilst they have an opportunity. Then the fourth additional factor or confounding factor is referred to as cumulative resources. So this is when being in control of resources makes it easy to protect or acquire additional resources. And finally, we can talk about what is called offense, defense, and the stability dilemma. What this basically means is that if conquest is easy, with minimal consequences for the aggressor, then they are more likely to get into conflict. So if a man thinks that, okay, I can abuse this woman, I can beat up these people, and there are no consequences for me, they're more likely to get into conflict. And if a nation thinks that it can annex a neighboring nation, and even though there will be international outcry, but there are minimal consequences for them, then they are more likely to do that. And I think we can think of Russia annexing Crimea within that context. So as you can see, the factors and conditions behind aggression apply across all levels of conflict, from nations to small groups to individuals. But if you think about it, murder, mass murder, terrorism, and assault are all dominated by these secular causes. And you notice that I said terrorism too. So most acts of terror are committed by people who are political separatists. They want to apportion a certain part of the country to themselves, and they're not actually perpetrated by religious extremists. So the world is not divided into religious people and non-religious people. It's normally divided into anyone who holds any view. It might be religious or it might be not, versus somebody else who holds a different view. But it's too often the religious views that are blamed for differences, when secular differences have been responsible, as we've seen from the chat, for way far more conflict, wars, killings, oppression, and any other evil that you can name.
Okay, thanks, Melvin. Still though, wouldn't you, well, I would say religion is still thought of as the most divisive force in the world. Or would you disagree with that? Or what
Yeah,
would you say to that?
True. Religion seems to be pointed out as the most divisive in the world. But the reason for this is not because it is. It's the most common reason for this is misinformation. So some of this misinformation is unintentional. People just parrot what they've heard from others, and they don't sit down to think exactly about why they're saying it. But at other times, it's hard to argue that there aren't deeper motives behind the statements about religion. So you'll recall the infamous propaganda minister in Nazi Germany, that man by the name Joseph Goebbels. So he's reported to have said at one time, the most brilliant propagandist technique will yield no success unless one fundamental principle is borne in mind constantly. It must confine itself to a few points, and you repeat them over and over and over. So basically he's saying that if you want to make people believe something, say a single lie or say a few lies and repeat them often and often. If you repeat them often enough, people will end up believing the lie. And this is especially true of us in this age when many people fail to look beyond the sensational headlines that we see in many of the broadsheets and on the internet. So we've seen already in the chat before that less than 7% of the world's wars were over religion. It turns out that fewer than 2% of all human history's casualties of war were in these wars of religion. So again, let's look at the belief that the main driver of terrorism is religious violence. This is incorrect. Fewer than 4% of terrorist acts are due to religion or religious groups. The vast majority of terrorist acts are committed by political separatists, as we said. And in fact, even animal rights activists commit more terrorist acts annually than religious fanatics. So people who want to protect certain animals will do more, they'll have more acts of violence than people who are religious fanatics. So people with mental health problems also perform acts of terror. Now, of course, there's a question of the categorization of public acts of violence as terrorism in the Western world based on race, but then that's a discussion for another day.
Okay, thanks, Merlvin. Right, understood. Now, if I take you back to my original question, which was, don't you think the world would be a better place without any religious beliefs? Because that, you find, is quite commonly asked by a lot of people.
So this question was following on from an earlier question that assumed that religion was the cause of conflict. But as we can see, that's not actually necessarily true. In fact, the evidence we have suggests that it is not true. One of the other books that I referred to before actually says that it has not been proven. It is not true, basically, based on what we can tell. But let's look at that. So we're saying that is the world better off without religion? Now let's look at the history of the world's worst mass murderers. They look at the leaders and the terrorists, the leaders of the countries that committed the most murder. We can look at Joseph Stalin, Russia. He's said to have killed more than 42,600,000 people. And then we go to China, we look at Mao Zedong. He is said to have killed 37,828,000 people as part of the Chinese Revolution. We look at the infamous gentleman Adolf Hitler in Germany. He killed 20,946,000 people. Look at a gentleman called Chiang Kai-shek. He killed 10,214,000 people. Of course, we go back to Russia, look at Vladimir Lenin. He killed more than 4 million people. A gentleman called Hideki Tojo, who killed 3,990,000. And somebody else called Pol Pot, who killed over 2,300,000, nearly 2.4 million. Now, all these people that I'm mentioning, they're in the top 7 murderers in history, mass murderers. Not a single one of them did it for religious reasons. In fact, if you just take Joseph Stalin and Mao Zedong, they account for more murders than all the religiously motivated killings in all of history, as far as we can tell. But all the people that we've mentioned, these 7 that we've mentioned, are on the list primarily because they were trying to eradicate religions. So they were doing exactly what the question proposes, that, okay, let's get religion out of the question. And in the process, they killed a lot more people than all of religion has ever killed, in multiple times over. So it appears to me that keeping religion would actually save way more lives than getting rid of religion ever could. So that's the first point. Should we keep religion? The second one is, let's look at the actual teachings of most religions. And we're not just going to confine ourselves to Christianity or Judaism. So most religions teach against greed, envy, unbridled quest for power or gain against evil. In contrast to teaching against this, they teach very positively, and they have done so for millennia. They've championed the feeding of the hungry, clothing of naked, healing the sick, offering shelter to the homeless, looking after widows and orphans, and countless other acts of charity. And they say you should do this every single hour of every day. So that is not to say that there are no false adherents or people who fail to live by the ideals of each religion. But I'm sure we can appreciate that even in secular organizations and movements or political systems, there are both true and false adherents. But overall, we only need to look at the institutions that have been set up and the benefits and the outcomes of religious groups to see the good that comes from religion. So for instance, you can see from religion, you get good schools, colleges and universities. Often in this country, for instance, people want to get their children into religious schools because it's religious and it's got a good education. In many parts of the world, the best hospitals and health institutions are run by religious organizations. In parts of the world that lack development, third world, you have missionaries such as doctors, teachers, nurses, builders of different types who provide healthcare where it is scarce, who provide education where it is non-existent, and who build structures that help improve lives. You have, even in this country, faith-based food aid organizations, faith-based clean water ministries, faith-based food pantries, soup kitchens, faith-based substance abuse rehabilitation facilities. You have faith-based homeless shelters, faith-based women's shelters. Marriages have been saved by religious organizations. Jobless people are counseled by religious organizations. The sick are visited, the grieving are comforted, and there are countless other acts of service. So broadly speaking, I think the world is a much better place for having religion.
Yeah, you seem to have convinced me there. Well, I am convinced. The one thing, though, I thought I'd mention, somebody has put a comment on the side, where regarding, the percentages where you spoke about before, the 7%. Now, they're saying, basically, if I could just find a question, even if it's only, here goes the question, even if it's only 7% of the total wars, the impact should be the focus. For example, the impact of colonization in Africa, which is far-reaching and so deep. It is still felt today. So I think essentially what we're trying to do is obviously bring to our attention that the damage, whilst it's still 7%, it does leave a lasting impact.
I think when it comes to specific examples like colonization, which has been referenced to in the question is, was colonization really about religion? There is often the image that is portrayed of the Bible on one hand and the gun in the other. Was it about forcing people to accept religion, or was it a quest for control of resources and land? And what we see is that the prime driver was actually resources. And when we began the discussion, we spoke about the initial prime drivers: land, resources, power, control. Okay. So in terms of that, we wouldn't say that specific example is a result of religion. It's more likely a result of other causes, not necessarily religion.
Okay, I mean, there are a couple of other questions which more or less relate to what I'm going to ask you later on. So I'll come to that point. But there is one here which I will read out to you. Don't you think that it's people's perception of God is what creates all this conflict and confusion? What if someone whose siblings were abused or raped in a Christian establishment, and because of this, she hates religion and all form of Christianity? How could you help her to recognize that religion is relevant? I see this particular individual's point, because that, has been, I think, in the news as well of late with regard to religious figures being involved in quite heinous crimes. So I do not know if you've got anything to say to that as well.
Yes, again, we go back to what we said before, that in every religion, just like if you look at the major political parties or any organization, you have true and false. And unfortunately, the false can go right all the way to the top of the organization. So that is part of the problem, that sometimes you get people who are not really converted, as it were, into a religion, but they are in senior levels of control, and they become responsible for the acts of harm that cause conflict, that cause bloodshed, that cause damage to others. So that is the first problem. And then the second issue is what our previous speaker alluded to, that there are psychological factors at play. And the world is made up of damaged individuals, and their behavior is a result of the factors that were influential in their growing up, as it were.
I mean, the question here, I do not know whether it is within your remit or not. By all means, do correct me if I'm wrong. They are asking, how can you help, let's say, this individual who's faced abuse, recognize, that religion is still relevant, because she hates religion because it did happen within the Christian surroundings and environs. So,
right. So anyway,
to share?
Yeah, I think I get your question now. So what we're saying now is it's a multi-layered question. So something happens,
yes.
there is abuse, and that creates a perception in relation to what religion is, because this has happened within a specific context. So if it had happened in a club, they would always hate the club. If it had happened at a sports center, they would hate sports, but this actually happened in terms of religion. So the abuse in and of itself creates a lot of emotional and psychological complications. And these have to be dealt with at a professional level. Now, there's a role for the church, for religion, but then there's also a role for clinicians who deal with psychological issues. So the first instance, the person would need to go to a specialist psychologist, such as the presenter we've just had. So they would deal with underlying problems. And then in terms of actual religion, then it's a matter of then understanding, as part of that treatment process, the difference between religion and the acts of certain rogue individuals within that. I see a question here that I would like to respond to in the remaining 2 minutes. It says, does it mean it's acceptable if conflict is the cause of the conflict, if religion is the cause of the conflict? And it's kind of related to a question I was going to close with, because the person references the Bible and says in the Bible, God supported and fought so many battles. So there's a strong misconception that because the Bible references violence and references conflict, therefore religion was the driver behind all the wars in the Bible. Now let's look at the Bible. The Bible is a book of history as well as a book of morality, as a book of religion. So some of the issues that it mentions are historical. So for instance, if we look at the wars that the nation of Israel fought, we can start off with Abraham, which is mentioned in the book of Genesis. He is involved in a war or a battle, but that is actually, he is helping his nephew who has been captured in a war of aggression that was targeting resources. So he rescues his nephew. Then we look at the Israelites when they move into Canaan. What had happened, the Canaanites had been given a period of 400 years of mercy. Then within that time, instead of changing and becoming better, they'd actually gone worse, so that by the time the Israelites were invading the land, as it were, the people were practicing infanticide. They were killing their own children in fire. So we can look at the wars that the Israelites were taking part in as they invaded the land as actually wars of morality to stop evil practices that were not good. Just as we are happy with going into a country when the leader of that country is killing his own people. So why should we say that is acceptable now and not acceptable back then? And then there were subsequent wars that the Israelites were involved in after they had settled in the land. In a lot of cases, they were attacked by their neighbors and they acted in self-defense. But the prime drivers in those cases were the neighbors or themselves fighting over resources, over land, and over the social factors that we've highlighted before. So all these come into the mix. While there is some aspect of religion in there, we should not think that it was exclusively the cause. The prime drivers, the secular drivers are still at play. Resources, power and control, as well as morality and social factors. I think we've covered that in the time available.
Thank you so much, Merlvin. Just before you go, I can see we have a Dr. Chizema from Malawi. Thank you so much for joining us on this platform. I've got a comment that's been made as well. Religion is a problem. If we go with Christianity as Christ-like is about our spirituality, then the focus is different. Christianity promotes peace, etc. Religion corrupts this. Regardless of the 7% or 4%, etc., it should not happen. Dr. Chizema apparently had a comment, so I'll just try and find out where the comment is from Dr. Chizema. Just bear with me.
Well, I think he was commenting on the previous speaker's presentation. So just
okay.
It's at 7:56. So
okay, he did want apparently to ask it loud. So if we've got access to Dr. Chizema, would someone to allow him to speak?
We have to close.
Unmute him.
Please, we will, yeah.
Okay, just bear with me for a moment. I think I have pressed unmute.
Yeah, thank you very much.
You're welcome. Go ahead.
I've enjoyed the discussions from the onset. My in-law stays there, so she's the one who shared for the powerful topics and very important. But I think one thing that I've just learned over the last speaker is to appreciate that this world is come out of sin now. It was way back in the Garden of Eden where we still have to see the war beginning there. So some of these things that we are seeing are just fruits of what was sowed then, but God is trying to do his level best to bring us back to what he initially thought was good for man. But anyways, we still have to deal with the consequences along the way. No wonder we have got all these people around, professionals and all that, trying to pull up things together, including the religion, which is also a most powerful institution. But I think we just have to remember that we have a background, that a conflict of all ages was began in the Garden of Eden. If I noted that the comments were also emanating from the Bible, so hence my also comment from the Bible. So it's a conflict that began and the conflict that is going towards the end. But the question is, we need to get ourselves organized. And along the way, we have got others that are standing in as professionals to keep on supporting us, inclusive of the Bible.
Thank you for your comments. We've had lots of information tonight, and I think you'll agree that we're asking all to give feedback on the platform, if you are able to do so, on tonight's meeting or on the previous meetings on the Transformation website. So there's lots more to come. So please join us again tomorrow at 7 for another in the series, Total Transformation. Thank you for being with us, and good night.